negotiation in the end is going to be some level of persuading, but you can't get to persuading anyone if you haven't at least built a foundation of trust.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Sarah Robb O'Hagan. Sarah is amazing. She has worked at Virgin Atlantic. She's worked at Nike. She's worked at Gatorade, being president there. She's written a book called Extreme You, Stand Up, Stand Out, Kick Ass, and Repeat. She is a person who has certainly kicked ass. She's managed multiple turnarounds, and we talk about how do you negotiate a turnaround, how do you negotiate and influence teams, how do you mediate in an organization between sales and marketing. We talk about gender and negotiation and the role being a woman has played in her career. I think you'll really enjoy the conversation. Sarah Robb O'Hagan, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Stan. It's great to be here.
Been super excited for this conversation. There's so much that you've done, and let's just dive in from the beginning. Mm-hmm. You got one of the dream jobs that a young person might want. You got to work with Richard Branson at Virgin Atlantic, and I'm sure had a fabulous time there. Tell us about that experience.
I mean, it was fabulous. And I did have that as my dream job. I moved to America, and I had two companies in my sights, Virgin and Nike. And Virgin was the first one I wanted to knock off the list. And yeah, in those days, the thought of working for Richard Branson was amazing. And I did, in fact, get to not just work for him, but to meet him and spend time with him, which sounds awesome until I got my ass fired, Stan. It didn't go so well.
What did you do to get fired? He seems like a pretty flexible guy.
No, it's funny because I actually worked for two divisions. Firstly, I worked for Virgin Atlantic Airways, which is the airline. And I did have a great success there doing some marketing campaigns. And I ended up literally partying at the Cannes Film Festival with Richard Branson. So I kind of thought I was pretty damn amazing, as you would expect. And then when they moved me to Virgin Megastores, which was the music retail store, which many of your listeners won't know that we used to buy music on a thing that goes around in a circle from a retail store. I realize that's hard to understand. But I joined Virgin Megastores literally the year Napster was invented, which is insane when you think about it. It's the first original tech disruption story. And so the business was in a huge crisis, and yet I'm acting like I'm the coolest person in town, and I've been partying with Richard, and you should listen to me because I'm cool and I know what Richard wants. Yeah, not so much. That's just not a great way to influence your teammates or build relationships. And I was honestly just like this rogue force. And a year into it, I had that fateful day where you come to the office and you get called into your boss's office and HR is there, and they gave me a one-way ticket back to New Zealand and basically said, "You are so bad, we do not want you in our company or our country."
I've never heard of anyone being kicked out of the country with their job. Wow, you must have really done some tough stuff. Well, you landed on your feet and you got your second dream job at Nike. You ran the women's, I think, the clothing division. What did you learn from that experience, especially as it applies to negotiation?
Yeah, as it applies to negotiation, I actually, after Virgin and before Nike, I worked at a company called Atari where I had ended up actually getting laid off, not necessarily all my own fault. The company was downsizing. But what that meant is by the time I get to Nike, which was my dream job, I was so humble and so I will do anything to be successful that thankfully by then I had learned that, which I think is super important for negotiation, that nothing matters until you've built relationships and understood who you're working with and what's important to them and what their goals are and how you can help them. And so I think, in my first 6 months at Nike, I just remember literally making an intentional note on my calendar every week that just doing things like pumping out great strategic documents is not okay. You have to spend as much time on your calendar building relationships, going and spending time, asking people what they do, how they do it, how long they've been here, what can I learn from them? And that honestly made the most significant difference to my trajectory there.
Interesting. I recently had Shannon Roberry, one of the Nike athletes. I think she was 20 years at Nike. And, she characterized the early days of Nike as a very male-oriented, male-dominated company. Did you find that when you came in?
Definitely. But it's funny, you and I chatted about this. I do think there's an interesting generational difference because it was a very male-dominated company, but every company was male-dominated in those days. So it didn't feel to me any different to anywhere else that I had worked. And I think, my approach to it was just like, well, I'm here and I deserve to be here and I'm going to do the best job that I can do. And certainly I, enjoyed and I had to build a lot of those relationships with the men that I worked with. But, for me, that wasn't, I wouldn't sort of count it as something that was a negative in the column of being able to work there, I guess.
Okay, running the women's line, you had to deal with the product people, the advertising people. I remember you telling me about a conflict you had with the person that was running advertising. Maybe characterize who that was, give us some flavor for that person and how you successfully or unsuccessfully negotiated with them.
Yes. Yeah, so I was running the brand marketing for women's, as you described, and she was overseeing all of advertising for all categories. So Nike's a classic matrix organization, which means there was somebody that reported to Nancy, my colleague, the advertising colleague, who reported to her, but was a dotted line to me on the women's integrated marketing team. And so I was trying to get a new campaign launched. By the way, it was around our fitness dance product line featuring a very unknown star called Rihanna. I can claim, look what she went on to be. And we were trying to get this thing off the ground, and the advertising person on the team kept coming every week to meetings saying, well, we're doing something different. We're not going to be running this fitness dance campaign, and we're working on something else. And I just was horrified. I was like, well, what are you talking about? We're all doing the same thing. Why are you rowing in a different direction? And really what it came down to is her boss, Nancy, actually had been at Nike 20 years and understood so much better than I did what was going to ignite a cultural conversation in the marketplace. And so she was really kind of sticking to her guns on what the advertising messaging should be. And in the end, I kept saying to my boss, you need to tell Nancy to get in line. And my boss kept saying, you need to go talk to Nancy, which was exactly the right thing to say. And in the end, I would describe it as a negotiation with Nancy to sort of get on the right page of how our two teams were going to work together. But that negotiation started with me recognizing at the launch of the campaign that her work was fundamentally brilliant. And had she not stuck her guns, it wouldn't have gone into the marketplace. And I needed to sort of listen and learn and not be so bullheaded, I guess, into what I was trying to get done.
Interesting. So negotiation really as listening and learning rather than persuading and trying to influence them. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, well, and I would say, yes, negotiation in the end is going to be some level of persuading, but you can't get to persuading anyone if you haven't at least built a foundation of trust. So at the beginning, Nancy's sitting there going, who's this new young hotshot who knows nothing about Nike trying to tell my people what to do? She had every right to feel that way. Whereas if I had started from the beginning with, actually, let me just spend time getting to know you. Let me understand what you've learned in your 20 years. I probably would have thought quite differently about how the integrated teams work should have come together. But I just didn't even take that first step. So how can you then come back and persuade that person if there's just not even a base level of trust?
I find that that's fairly typical in my career of people that are either young or new in an organization. They come in and they're pretty good at diagnosing the problems, and they can see and they think, oh, these old people, if they just would be quicker to adjust.
Yeah.
Is that your experience? And what would your advice be to a young person starting their career of how they enter a company based on your experience?
Yeah, I love this question, Stan, because it's so true. By the way, I've done it a million times myself, and I've seen so many people do it. And so first things first, like my favorite line that everyone must remove from their language is, well, we used to do it this way at my old company and it worked, and people tend to default to that when no one's listening to them. They're like, it's the only thing I've got is I can prove to you that I've done it before. And actually, if you've gotten to the point where that's your reason to convince someone, you've missed about 25 steps along the way. So I always say now, like the classic thing, soft skills are the hard skills. Like you have to spend so much time building relationships and listening and learning before you begin to try and implement your new ideas. And so often you're right that you do see all the things that can be fixed, which is super easy to do as the new person, by the way. And there's an arrogance to that because often the people who are sitting there may have had the same ideas 5 years ago also, but there's a number of reasons you may not understand as to why they didn't get fixed. So how about having a conversation about that and listening and learning and kind of going, is this something that we want to fix together, as opposed to I want to be the hero that came in with all these new ideas. And I think it's human nature, because when you're brand new in a company, you so badly want to prove yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to say, I observed all these things and I came up with this idea. But the reverse is so much more true. If you're going around and bringing people into your observations, refining the observations with others, suddenly they are going to be on board with wanting to help you be successful, which is a far more sustainable approach.
So well put. The implementation piece is the hard thing. And I'm thinking of a Shakespeare quote from the play, The Merchant of Venice, where I think it's Portia who says, if to do were as easy as to know what we're good to do. And lots of us know what to do, and not that many people can implement and actually get stuff done. And I always tell young people, if you can go into an interview and describe how you helped to get stuff implemented and done, you're going to get hired. Mm-hmm. It really is. Have you been able to plow through resistance and get things done? Just telling people what the right answer is, it's a dime a dozen. So I really agree with you.
You're spot on. I love that, actually. And I'm going to steal that because, yes, it's like anyone can see the observation. And I think the other big thing that I have become a huge advocate for now that I didn't understand and I wished I did 20 years ago is understanding that different people have different thinking styles. So said another way, you might come in to a new company and see immediately, oh my God, this system over here is broken and should be fixed. But the act of implementing, like you just said, is overwhelmingly hard. So to get people on board, you have to convince them that that's a great thing to go do. And if their thinking styles are different to you, so as an example, I have a explorer thinking style, so I'm really good at seeing the big, exciting top of the mountain we're going to go to. But if the person I'm working with is an optimizer, who's someone who really thinks about details of how to get to the top of the mountain, and they're looking at me going, she's clueless, they're going to be fearful, right? And they're going to sit there going, I don't want to follow her. I don't want to trust her. Whereas if I spend time understanding that this person has a different thinking style, and oh, by the way, I need that to help me not get halfway up the mountain with not enough food, together you're going to get to a much better outcome, and people are going to feel more willing to push along with you.
I'm going to underscore something you said there that I think is so valuable, which is diversity. There's lots of talk these days about diversity on teams, diversity in companies, diversity in boards. But it's not in my view, nice to have for appearance purposes. It is actually, whether it is gender, race, culture, thinking style, people actually bring different things to the table. Yep. And so if we saw diversity as not something you should comply with in a DEI way, but something that helps you get to a better answer, I think it would be so much easier to implement.
Oh, 100 million%. And I think I think what's interesting is like that in all of these conversations, I think most of us now acknowledge and understand that breadth of diversity is so important at, getting to better innovation, better ideas, et cetera. But I also think sometimes we trip up on we need all these different views, but there comes a point where it actually isn't a democracy in everyone deciding what we're going to do to go forward. Like sometimes someone is the leader is going to have to break the tie and go. And I think sometimes we almost struggle with that too. It becomes analysis paralysis. So there's a fine line between bringing everyone in and making sure you've gotten all of those great inputs and then going, like we used to say at Gatorade, debate until you're sick of it, then commit, and get going.
That's nice. I want to turn to your career at Gatorade. And again, just what you're saying is so good. I want to underscore a point, which is essentially that as a junior person, the best you can do is be able to have your case heard. You get to make your case.
Yep.
You're not the decision maker.
Yep.
And so that's the advice to the junior people is as long as you got to make your case, feel good. As a senior person, you have to make it clear, what the chain of command is. And if it is at all wishy-washy, if you don't have people that are there making decisions. I was preparing for a class I taught yesterday and going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, President John Kennedy had a lot of advice that was the opposite of what he ended up doing. And people were upset that he didn't follow their advice. But he basically heard diverse opinions and then made a tough judgment call. It ended up being a very good judgment call and a successful negotiation. But both sides of that, both as a senior person, as a junior person, if you can understand that a good leader lets other people make their case and then takes the information and makes an informed choice, that's really leadership.
100%. And I actually think I love how you framed up both sides of that, because I will say, I think in the last, 10, 15 years, the good news is that the nature of communication in all of our workplaces has become so open that as the leader, you're hearing from everyone all the time. I mean, my father ran a small meat processing company in New Zealand. There is no way junior people from the factory floor would have had any access to the CEO ever, whatsoever. Whereas now, daily, I'll get LinkedIn pings, you get, Slack messages. So that's great, right? I think it's really cool for not only young people to make their case and be heard, but I think as the leader, you're constantly getting more opinions. However, I also think sometimes these more junior members don't understand it. It's like you're putting your case forward, but you're actually not yet aware that the decision maker has to put the consequences on the table as well. So often I would get people complaining, we want this or this. And most senior people, decisions you're making inherently are trade-off decisions, whereas the young person making their case is really only thinking about their side. So I'll give you a great example. In my last company, we were going through a lot of social justice stuff, as we all did in 2020. And we were a company in massive crisis. We were literally struggling to stay financially afloat, and lots of people, struggling to keep people in jobs. And we had this huge debate with some of our employees, bringing to my attention that we didn't have, I think it was Juneteenth as a public holiday, which if it was my choice, I'd totally agree with you. We should have Juneteenth. But I was like, and we also just greenlit our first extended maternity benefits for the company. So I had to make a choice, one or the other. And last month, all of you were saying you wanted the maternity benefits. And the point is, as a leader, you are constantly having to make those trade-off decisions. And I think sometimes the younger employees are just like, but sure, there's just no way it can't be that my side is the only side. And I speak from experience as being that younger employee.
The irony is people don't want to hire older employees. They want the younger employees. And they might be getting what they deserve in that choice based on the way you told your story. I love it. Yeah. It's amazing how two things come to mind. One is young people tend not to understand complexity is how I would summarize what you said. And the other thing is they tend to, from a negotiation perspective, not understand that there are multiple parties whose interests are important.
Yeah.
They see things as sort of a one-on-one negotiation.
Yeah.
And so complexity and the nature of multi-party negotiations is something that's often not learned till later in one's career, in my experience.
And probably the flow-on effects if you didn't think about all those parties. Like you might negotiate something thinking you won, and then...
Exactly. Let's turn to Gatorade. You, because of your success at Nike, were asked to come in and be the president of Gatorade. As I remember, you joined at kind of a tricky time. I think you characterized it to me as we were trying to shift from a solution for hangovers to a solution for athletes. Any negotiations in that process? It was sort of a turnaround. And turnarounds to me are, startups and turnarounds are one constant negotiation.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, it was more than turnaround. It was 2008 recession. Actually, Fast Company described the business as a flaming mess at one point. Like it was pretty bad. $5 billion business. And in the year of 2009, we lost $500 million of revenue off the top line in 1 year. I mean, it was a massive, massive crisis.
I bet the retailers weren't too happy about that because that affects their bottom line as well.
The retailers, the investors, the analysts, the media, we were getting hit from every side for sure. And so, yes, and the reason was, you just said it beautifully, is the company, Gatorade, was at the time only a hydration product, and it had just been so mass marketed that it was just becoming this thing that people sat on the couch and had to, as a hangover cure or with a pizza watching the football, as opposed to a athletic performance enhancement, which is what it was designed for. So the turnaround involved us really, really going from this mass market approach to very, very focused on athletes and making new products that met the needs of athletes, like recovery shakes and energy shots. And the entire system, talk about resistance, everywhere we turned, we had, whether it was our sales team, our bottling organization, the retailers themselves, everything was, this is too risky that you're trying to do. I just want my old Gatorade the way it was, and I want the sales back the way they were. And the reality is, it's like, that ain't happening. Like, we used to use that line, like, how's today working for you? Like, it's not, like, doing nothing is not an option. So yes, it became daily negotiations of, trying, because if you had, for example, I can still remember one individual who led our warehouse sales organization who just fundamentally disagreed with the strategy. And so if he doesn't agree, what do you think he's saying to his 500 sales guys? Like that's even though the company line is that we're doing this, he's going to be saying something completely different. So I had to learn the hard way. And again, I wished I'd understood thinking styles better. That I think in those days, my strategy was just individual heroics. I mean, I personally gave the Gatorade turnaround pitch over 250 times in 1 year, because I think I felt like if I just keep saying it, eventually they'll listen. But, and we got there, but there was a lot of brain damage. And I think if I look back, had I understood thinking styles, I would have said, okay, next time I go meet with this individual, I need to bring other people that can help me hear his concerns better and help me solve for his concerns better and help bring him along and understand his needs in the context of where we're trying to go.
So in a turnaround, I mean, I can't imagine doing 250 pitches. You probably got pretty good at it. But in a turnaround, you've got to convince people, that warehouse manager or others, to come along. Going back to, a lesson that you mentioned that you learned at Nike, you've got to listen to them before trying to lead them. Were you able to do that effectively? Did your lesson transfer from Nike, sort of listen before leading?
Yeah.
How would you grade yourself on that?
I'd say not as bad as I was when I had first got to Nike, but not as good as I would be now. It's like, and I think, every step along the way you learn. And I think what made Gatorade so much more complex is like, had I gone into a business as healthy as Nike, I think I would have had the time to apply all of these great lessons I'd learned. Whereas when you're in a turnaround and it's a crisis and you've been there 4 months and you're being told if you don't turn it around, you're going to lose your jobs and it's a crisis, like you're panicked. And it's not even so much that I was trying to prove that I deserve to be there. It was like, we have to demonstrate results fast, you know? So it's almost like every battle like that was just like exhausting and slowing us down. It's like, you just got to come along. I don't know how to tell you, you know? And actually, it's like anything in life, you do have to slow down to speed up. Actually, if we'd slowed down a heck of a lot and sort of spent more time bringing all of these people along and incorporating some of their thoughts into the strategy, I just think it would have been a smoother execution.
Interesting. So you're still learning, we'll say, that lesson. Still some lessons to learn in your career. I'm interested in the retailers because, I only know the Gatorade product through where I buy it at a retailer. They were obviously upset that sales were down, affecting their sales.
No, so the thing about Gatorade is, yes, you have the vast majority of your business is done in a place like Walmart. Not surprisingly, Amazon wasn't as big as they are now. But then these large grocery chains, Safeway on the West Coast, like are not as big, but highly influential. And I remember I had given this pitch to all of these retailers and every single one was like, you're crazy. This isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. Until I got to Safeway, and it turned out that the CEO sat in the presentation because he had a personal interest as a cyclist in Gatorade, had always loved the franchise, was very proud of how he had outperformed the market for Gatorade sales and was very invested. And he was like, I want to hear what this is about. And being that he was an athlete and the parent of athletes, he immediately understood it and got it and was like super energized. And I'm here to help. How can I help? And so we put a disproportionate amount of effort into this one retailer because I think by then I learned if we can prove our case in one place, that's a better way for other retailers to see this will work than me just trying to convince them on vapor, you know?
So really bringing him along led to other dominoes falling after that, and you were ultimately successful in that turnaround.
And I do think that is, honestly, Stan, you tell me, but that is negotiation 101. Like if you're negotiating with however many people on the other side, finding the ones that are what I call the early adopters, those alpha, I get it, who are excited, like how do you just put your arms around them to help them influence others to come along, I think is super important.
Yeah, and my experience is both internally and externally. If you can find a staff member, and it doesn't mean that they are the COO or even in the C-suite at all, but finding those internal champions, I think, can make a huge difference in persuasion and influence.
Yeah, definitely. Big time. Big time.
So one of the themes in your career is you tend to do things that are very fitness-oriented, sports-oriented. After you succeeded at the Gatorade turnaround, you went and were president of Equinox Fitness. Most listeners will remember seeing a lot of, Equinox Fitness gyms. Just talk about that experience, what you came into there and what you did.
Yeah, so I joined Equinox in 2012, and it is still like the leader in luxury fitness globally, I'd say at this point. But it had the experience inside the gyms was amazing, but they had woefully underinvested in technology for a period of, 15 years probably. So that was, in 2012, this sounds hard to believe, but like we didn't have an app. We didn't have a functional website, basic things. The systems that ran the clubs from the back end were so old that they were barely operational. So a lot of what I was involved in there was a massive sort of tech and product transformation to try and move the consumer experience to a much more, modern place like it is today. Funny, now I think about it, that the world of streaming fitness came along because, that didn't exist back then either, right? So had they not gotten ahead of the need to build the tech infrastructure, I think it would have been tough.
So one of the things that almost every organization has, you mentioned that you kind of had to get out and work on sales, and there were marketing folks doing something different. There's often a tension between sales and marketing, especially if it's a turnaround. Did that happen at Equinox?
Big time. Absolutely. And it's funny, you're spot on. Like in every company I've been in, sales is always pointing the finger at marketing, didn't give us enough leads, and marketing's like sales isn't closing them fast enough. That's the tried and true old trope, really. But in this case, yes, like a lot of the tech change was being led by marketing, and therefore it was causing all sorts of disruption with the sales advisors. And so all sorts of things were not going along as planned. And I do remember like a lot of sort of passive aggressive, like the sales and marketing team just totally beating on each other the whole time. And in that case, so it wasn't me trying to influence, but I was aware as the boss of both sides that I needed to help them negotiate, come to an agreement. And I do remember taking the heads out to breakfast one morning and basically saying, if this was Survivor, no one's getting voted off the island. Like, you're going to have to figure out how to work together because we actually all want the same thing. And I'm going to stop speaking and ask the two of you, to start having the conversation together. And what was interesting is like, it did lead to tremendous improvements. And it seems so basic, but I think this happens so much in corporate America where we just avoid these tough conversations. And if you would just have the conversation, there's always more in common than you even realize, and it just requires where we started this, taking time, building trust, getting to know each other as humans, getting to get a sense that you're not trying to screw me over. I actually think we are trying to do the same thing,
Yeah. As you say that, I feel like more women, and again, correct me if you don't think this is correct in terms of gender, but you took a very relational approach, which is when you go to breakfast, you're essentially playing facilitator or mediator. I find that women tend to be better at that. Man, I'm thinking of a situation where I was on a board once, and one of the board members was upset in a very similar situation. He'd been interim CEO of this company, and sales and marketing were fighting. And so he just, at the first staff meeting, they were kind of bitching at each other. Mm-hmm. And he said, hey, the two of you, it was all men. So the sales guy was a man, the marketing guy was a man, the CEO was a man. He said, tell you what, I don't know what's going on between you guys, but I don't like it. Mm. And so what I want you to do is I want you guys to go to lunch. I think it was lunch and not breakfast, and try to work it out. Mm. And then come back and tell me how it went. And by the way, if you tell me anything other than you're going to work well together in the future, I'm going to arbitrarily fire one of you at the end of today.
Oh my God.
That was just a very transactional male approach, where yours was much more relational, communication oriented. And it sounds like, I'm guessing sales and marketing ended up working better together after that breakfast.
So it totally did. But I want to know, did it work?
Well, it's interesting. It didn't work out. He arbitrarily fired one of them.
Whoa.
And then about 10 years later, he was brought in to be interim CEO of another company. And that same guy who he had fired, before was working at the company.
Oh, no.
And he called him in and he said, look, it didn't work out last time. I don't think it's going to work out this time. You're fired. So he fired him twice.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Not the most, probably not the most effective negotiation story. But look, I do think that it's worth underscoring. And let's talk a little bit about gender and negotiation, because I find that when I negotiate with men and when I negotiate with women, I take a different approach.
Interesting.
Talk a little bit about just, you grew up in New Zealand. How did that impact the way you thought about your gender as you were, leading these companies in the U.S.?
Yeah. No, I do feel incredibly lucky that I grew up in New Zealand. We were the first country in the world to give women the vote, which was in 1892, compared to 1920 in the US. That's a big difference if you think about it. That's 30 years. And therefore, I grew up in an environment where, it just never occurred to me that I couldn't or shouldn't do all the same things that my male peers could do. Even when I moved to America, I remember hearing about this thing called Title IX. I was like, why would you need something called Title IX? It just didn't occur to me, And so I do think I have a uniquely different filter on gender in the workplace because I just didn't, it was never something that I felt was going to impact me. Now, fast forward to now, Me Too, and so many things have happened which have incredibly opened my eyes to the real discrepancies that exist. And thank God all of that did happen because I think it has helped us at least shine a light on those really significant areas where women are not being treated fairly, being held back, etc. I also think sometimes I see in circles of women in the workplace that all of the media around how bad Me Too was and how bad women were treated almost makes us show up expecting things are going to be bad and expecting someone's going to treat me badly, as opposed to I'm just going to walk in this door and do my best work as whether I'm male, female, or anything else in between, because I'm just here to get the job done. And I almost think it's like a different attitude when you just walk in with confidence as yourself.
Interesting. Jonathan Sachs, in his book Morality, talks about a victim mentality. And he really articulately says the following. I'm just paraphrasing, of course. He says, a lot of people actually are victims. Bad things happen to them. But no matter how bad that thing is, if you identify yourself as a victim, it's disempowering. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And because I also think that, yes, real bad things happen to people. But I also think everyone in the world has, I had a dear friend growing up, everyone has their shit to deal with, right? And it's how you deal with it. Like, you might have had an awful situation that's happened to you as a woman in the workplace, but you also might have extraordinary superpowers that someone else in the around the negotiation table doesn't. And if you focus on the former and not the latter, of course it's going to be disempowering. Whereas if you come in going, I am the only one in this room that has the capability of getting this deal done and let's roll, it's just a totally different and very empowering approach.
What would your advice be to young women coming in? How do you, if you don't feel confident, men tend to think they're better than they are. A lot of research about this. Women tend to think they're not as good as they actually are.
Yeah.
So what would your advice be to a young woman starting her career and coming into, a Nike, a Gatorade, the companies that you've worked at?
I think you just said it right on. Women think they're not as good as they are. So it's all about what's in your head. So therefore, I really, really believe this. Like, it's up to you to really get clear on where are these thoughts that are telling you a narrative versus what's actually fact. And I think the thing I have found when I mentor younger women over and over and over again is they will talk themselves or think themselves out of opportunities. And you'll be so surprised what happens when you actually step up and ask for, negotiate for, more often than not, your worst fears were, I don't know, that you'd get fired, that you'd be out of a job. And the total opposite happens. Either, okay, they didn't give you a raise, but they definitely now understand that you're on the radar for something, but we never think the positive outcome. We always assume the negative outcome. And once that's in your head, then I do think you have a tendency to play smaller than you should. So it's like going back to the Gatorade example, I do remember, this is actually a quick but funny story. When I interviewed for that job, I happened to interview on a Friday, which was Casual Friday. So I did not know. I assumed that the dress code at PepsiCo was casual. I turn up on my first day of work and I'm wearing sneakers and a horrible maternity outfit, and everyone else is in suits with ties, Stan. I mean, it was full on. And I'm sitting there going, oh, this is bad. But as I got a month into it and then gave my first pitch to the, most senior people in the company, and everyone's like, you have to find a suit, and I'm 6 months pregnant. It's like, because this is the way we dress. And I'm like, I am going to be so uncomfortable if I do that. And so in the end, I remember getting up that morning and going, I may get fired, but fuck it. I'm going to just go. I'm going to wear sneakers. I wear a little track jacket because I'm representing Gatorade, for goodness sake. And funnily enough, not only did nobody care of the senior brass, but I think it made the entire pitch so much more believable because I stepped into that moment as the most confident version of myself. And I spent probably 2 weeks festering over, I shouldn't do this. I'll get into trouble. I get into trouble. But when you do it, more often than not, it ends up being a positive outcome. So that's how I mentor younger women on that topic.
2 things there. One is I'm constantly advising younger people, men and women, take more risks. People just don't get to our generation and say, I took too many risks in my career. They always wish they had asked for the promotion, asked for the raise, asked for a different responsibility. Is that your experience?
100 million %. Actually, statistically, you know this as well as I do, every generation since the boomers has become more risk averse. And so it's almost like you have to study the data to understand this is real. You're not likely to take risks and it will hold you back. Therefore, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, and back to gender, women, I find, just need more mentoring on that. And a complaint that I get from women, you've done a great job in your career mentoring young women, but I do get the complaint from women pretty consistently. They feel like some of the senior women kind of pull up the ladder after them and aren't as willing to help them. Is that a real thing in your experience? And what's your advice to either the senior or the junior women on that topic?
It's a really interesting one because I personally never had that experience. And yet I'm 52, so I also had very, very few female bosses. I have Indra, who ran PepsiCo, who, she was one of the most powerful women in the world at the time. It's the first time I'd worked for a company run by a woman, and she did nothing but support me. So, I have not had that experience, but I do hear it a lot. So, I believe it must be real. But sometimes I do wonder to myself, is it a woman thing? Because I can think of guys that, pulled up the ladder before I got there. So I don't know. Is it a more senior person thing? Is it a age thing where people who are getting older in their careers become fearful because that's real? Suddenly when you're like, oh my goodness, I'm not AI native or whatever it's meant to be. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be age.
Yeah.
I would direct people to your social media, your website. We'll put links, in the podcast about those. But one of the links I saw this morning, a quote, I think you may have been quoting Tina Turner. It said, being over 40 is not an excuse to play it safe.
I love
which
that.
is just perfect in terms of what you're saying right now. We need to all take more risks.
100%. Like I wrote a blog post about Tina Turner because the late, great Tina Turner, she was 43 when she made a decision to escape a violent, abusive marriage. But what came with that decision was she was actually quite famous already, but she had to walk away from the legal right to sing any of the music that she had become famous with her husband on and literally start from scratch. So she's 43 and she's singing in small clubs, trying to build an audience. And it's a great story that she's in a club in New York and David Bowie happens to be in the audience and he introduces her to his producer. And if it wasn't for that chance moment, we wouldn't have What's Love Got to Do with It. She was the first woman to fill stadiums as a female, singer at probably 48. So I'm like, if Tina can do it, come on, we're just getting started.
That's excellent. Tina Turner is the role model, everybody.
Let's go.
I want to touch on one other job experience that you had before we do some final wrap up and questions. But you were asked to be the CEO of EXOS, which is basically a coaching company that both trains professional athletes, works with corporations on their health. Tell listeners a little bit about that and what you stepped into there and where negotiation played a role.
Yeah. I joined, EXOS is a phenomenal company. And I joined on the 1st of February, 2020. And at the time we ran 400 gyms around the world. So literally
There's a pattern here. Equinox to EXOS.
Yeah. There's, it was awful. Just shutting the business down, all of the above, making sure our employees were safe. But I would say where negotiation came in is like, stepping into a role where you think that you're here to a healthy little business and figure out how to grow it, et cetera, and suddenly you're in a huge crisis. So everyone's expectations have to be reset, whether it's the employee example I gave you earlier around we couldn't afford to give extra company holidays, because suddenly we're in a crisis, or the investor expectations who suddenly they've invested in this thing that's mortally wounded and may never get back to where their investment mark was. So I think to me that the negotiation there was just like really meaningfully putting in time to make sure we all understand this new normal. Because if you don't, and people are still on the old page, then by definition, you're gonna be battling along the way.
You had to convince companies, I would think this would be hard, that they needed to invest in the health of the employees. Was that an easy sales pitch, a hard sales pitch?
It was, initially, it was interesting. Not so easy because it's like everything's shut down, our gyms are shut down, and we're pivoting to virtual and all those things. But then interestingly, a year into the pandemic, the mental health crisis was so huge. And if you remember the quiet quitting, do you remember all of those headlines?
Yeah.
And employees were just fed up. And so I think at that point it became, suddenly all of our clients are calling us going, help, 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 help. How do we help our teammates? And so I actually think in the end, the quote unquote sales pitch got a whole lot easier.
I remember you telling me about an event that you staged in Phoenix where you're trying to get people to come. And for some reason, the word that sticks out in my mind is you kind of rolled up your sleeves and were really gritty.
Yes, we were trying to launch an entirely new business line selling into a different part of HR departments than what we'd typically sold into. And so for our whole team, it was just overwhelmingly hard because when you're, our typical point of contact in a company was the procurement person, and now we're trying to get to the CHRO. It's like our team's like, well, I don't even know how to do that. And so I realized early on that we were almost folding up our tent a little bit going, this will never work because we just couldn't. We've built a great product, but it can't be a great product. No one's going to want to buy this because we couldn't get to the buyer. So then in the end, I was like, all right, the leader sets the pace of the pack. So I just literally started cold calling everyone I'd ever worked with in my Rolodex and just said, will people be interested to test this out? And sure enough, a bunch of people not only came all the way to Phoenix, but became some of our early and most valuable, clients of the new product. So I think it was a good example of just sometimes you can't, what's the saying? Do what I say, not as I do, or do what I do, not as I say. Like in this
that's
case,
better.
Yeah, I had to just do it. I had to show that I'm in there as much as you are, and I'll roll my sleeves up as much as you are, and we will get this done.
So leading from the front is more persuasive than telling people what to do, and kind of dovetails nice with what we talked about before. I want to talk briefly about your book. You've got a fantastic book with a fantastic title called Extreme You, Step Up, Stand Out, Kick Ass, Repeat. And there's so many things I'd like to talk about, but one that jumped out at me was this idea of resilience that you talk about there. And so negotiations often don't go well, and you have to bounce back. So what would you say about that, about the importance of bouncing back and resilience?
Yeah, it's more important than ever, I think, in the world that we're in right now. And, it's funny, like I don't know. I've often wondered like where I got my own reservoir of resilience from, because I've been fired twice. I've had these massive business situations that have just crumbled in front of me and still had to figure out how to keep going. But I often find that resilience comes from my teammates. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I don't want to let the team down. And I think there's something, I'm actually working on my next book right now, Stan, and it is about the incredibly uplifting power of teammates to help us be the best version of ourselves. And I really believe that, like, sometimes in those toughest days or a negotiation that's fully falling apart, if you look to your left and your right and you realize, I don't want to be the one that let this team down, you'll keep going,
Yeah. Yeah. Our mutual friend, Mark Gainey, who introduced us, is really great at this, at kind of building the culture that he's built at Strava. And I'm happy that he introduced us.
Yes. The best. I love that.
Who have been the people? I mean, you've worked with, look, you've worked with a female CEO at Pepsi. You've worked with Richard Branson. You've just had such a tour. So are there people that jump out from your career as influential over you, and how did they influence you?
Yeah. Honestly, to me, by far the most influential people in my career have been what Adam Grant would call givers, not takers. It's as simple as that. Like Mark Gainey's a perfect example. Like, I happened to be on the board of Strava. That's how I got to know Mark, who's the founder. And he's that guy that will just, at any time that I text him, anyone who, he works with texts him, he will respond immediately. How can I help? And that has influenced me so massively in terms of wanting to be like that person. And there's people in the world like Mark, and then there are people in the world who are not, it's very transactional. And on the topic of negotiation, they want to win and see you lose.
Yep.
And it's funny, like going from Gatorade to Equinox. At Gatorade, if we were negotiating massive deals with professional athletes, at the end of the day, Tiger Woods, Serena Williams, I want them to feel as good on the other side of this negotiation as I do, because I want them to be fired up to get out there and talk about Gatorade. Whereas at Equinox, when we would negotiate real estate deals, and this is very prevalent in the real estate industry, it's very win-lose because it's transactional. Once it's done, I've done my deal with the landlord and it's over. And I just remember going, it's a fundamental difference. And the relationship building negotiator, the caring negotiator, the win-win negotiator, I think wins in the end.
That's so good. And I want to highlight two things there. One is the real estate transactional nature. Those often are one-time and one-off negotiations. I've heard from a number of people. I've never met our current president, but I've heard a number of people that negotiated with him who said a lot of people negotiated and did one deal with him and never would do another deal with him.
Totally.
You mentioned about Mark, and something to highlight there is responsiveness. I have just found responsiveness one of the most persuasive things in my career. And just like you learned that from Mark and others, I learned it early in my career. I had the opportunity to work on a transaction with Michael Dell, founder of Dell Computers. And by this time, he was one of the wealthier people in America. I just saw him as sort of 6 levels above me in the hierarchy of corporate America, and he certainly was. But he would respond to my emails always within a half an hour.
Yeah, amazing.
And I just thought, how is Michael Dell always getting back to me? And so one day I asked him, I said, Michael, do you do your own email or does your assistant do it? He says, no, I read every single email. I respond. And I was just shocked. And it was just so persuasive. And I thought, if Michael Dell can get back to me, I can get back to anyone, within a half an hour. And I really attempt to do that. And so, important lesson that we both learned about both responsiveness and relationship building.
100%. 100%.
Any other authors or public figures that have had a big impact on you and your life and have been influential to you?
I mean, it's funny. I mentioned Adam Grant. He's the very, very famous psychologist professor. I'm lucky enough to call him a good friend now. And he has had such an influence on me because he is someone with one of the greatest, most influential followings in the world. But the way he cares for people, responsiveness, he surrounds himself with amazing people, and he's very thoughtful about that. He's not someone who's like, oh, you're our current president.
Yeah.
He could care less about name title. It's just like, are they good, caring, giving people? And that's had a big influence on me for sure.
That's fantastic. Well, Sarah, this has been a great conversation. There's so many places that people can follow you, and I'm going to put links into that.
Awesome.
You're currently,
Appreciate that.
advising at a very high level, Fortune 500 companies on product strategies, on brand strategies, on culture, and a very in-demand motivational speaker. So I'm just happy that you took the time to speak with me today, and listeners are going to be the beneficiaries. So thank you so much.
Anytime. It's been a blast. Thank you, Stan.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. Please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend, and be sure to engage with us on social media. Your likes, comments, and reposts make a big difference and help others find the show. The show was produced by Ezra Trupiano, original music by Peter Breinhold, and designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.